All right, thanks for watching my channel, guys. We're going to talk about a topic that I had a viewer request we discuss, talking about concupiscence. And what is it? Concupiscence is evil desire, or more specifically, an inclination of the will to evil, of evil motions of the mind, coveting those things which God has forbidden. The corrupt disposition which inclines internally to actual sin, the inclination of desire to evil, but also the propensity of it to evil. So in summary, concupiscence is something that is internal rather than external. It is connected to desire, and it involves both the inclination and propensity of desire toward evil. Simply put, concupiscence is evil desire. It is sin. If you are reformed, this may seem like an obvious truth, but it has been a point of debate historically and in the current culture. Our current cultural context suggests that morality is either completely arbitrary and up to the individual to decide for themselves, or that ethics are social constructs, mutually agreed upon generalizations of society. Postmodernism seemingly has won the day in the realm of ethics. In the modern professing church, many are ignorant of Scripture and the church's best confessional and theological reflection. In the midst of postmodernism outside of the church, a subtle false doctrine has gained significant support since the dawn of the 21st century. Suddenly, there are many claiming that the desire to sin is not sin. Thus, without any historical or biblical precedent, new categories of Christians were invented overnight. Now we have gay Christians, or for some, gay but celibate Christians. This is side A and side B. At least for the so-called side B, a theological distinction that does go back to a key argument between the Protestant, Reformed Orthodox, and the Romanists and Socinians has reintroduced itself into the church. It is the idea that concupiscence is not a sin, at least under certain circumstances. The category of gay but celibate Christian depends upon this foundation. Homosexual desire itself is not a sin, at least they say. As long as it is not acted upon, then no sin has occurred. While this reveals a lot about our current context and what our society values, this debate has historical precedent. We will first look at the history of this issue, and then we will look at the biblical text. I proceed in this order because I do not accept the modern disdain for history, nor do I think that it would somehow, or that I would somehow have a more valid grasp on these issues by ignoring the mature reflection of theologians on Scripture. Failing to look at the conversation of the church over the last 2,000 years will result in us repeating the same errors, falling into the same traps, falling into the same ambiguity of language, etc. I do believe that the Bible is clear on this issue, but I'm not the first person to read the Bible, and I will not be the last either. I will begin with a view that I do not hold, but one which makes this discussion very much necessary. First, in our historical survey, we will look at the Roman Catholic view. Rome has historically made some key distinctions regarding sin. They separate sin into that which is venial and that which is mortal. Venial sins are considered minor offenses that do not cause one to fall from the grace of God. Mortal sins, however, do. Mortal sins require the sacrament of penance to restore the subject back into a state of grace. And before I go too much further, I will just cite many sections from the Catechism of the Catholic Church on these matters regarding sin, the fall, and concupiscence. I'll read the section number of the Catechism here so that you may refer to what Rome has to say about these issues. So that's what the numberings are if you're not familiar with that. 1856, mortal sin, by attacking the vital principle within us, that is charity, necessitates a new initiative of God's mercy and a conversion of heart which is normally accomplished within the setting of the sacrament of reconciliation. 1857, for a sin to be mortal, three conditions must be met. Mortal sin is sin whose object is a grave matter and which is also committed with full knowledge and deliberate consent. 1859, mortal sin requires full knowledge and complete consent. It presupposes knowledge of the sinful character of the act, of its opposition to God's law. It also implies a consent sufficiently deliberate to be a personal choice. Feigned ignorance and hardness of heart do not diminish, but rather increase the voluntary character of a sin. So I just want to highlight that this distinction between mortal sin in that it requires full knowledge and complete consent. This is very relevant for our discussion of concupiscence, which is evil desire, which doesn't require full knowledge and complete consent. And Rome, of course, has built in a mechanism whereby the sacrament of reconciliation, when that mortal sin is committed, can restore one to a state of grace. I will now go and look at that sacrament of penance and look at the Eucharist a little bit and baptism and see how Rome kind of ties these discussions into the concept of sin and guilt here. So 1422, those who approach the sacrament of penance obtain pardon from God or from God's mercy for the offense committed against him, and are at the same time reconciled with the church, which they have wounded by their sins, and which by charity, by example, and by prayer labors for their conversion. So again, that is that sacrament of penance after an offense has been committed against God, to restore the baptized person to the state of grace. 1394 says, as bodily nourishment restores lost strength, so the Eucharist strengthens our charity, which tends to be weakened in daily life, and this living charity wipes away venial sins. So there was the mechanism whereby mortal sins can be overcome, and that is through the sacrament of restoration and penance. And then venial sins through the Eucharist, it wipes away those venial sins. By giving himself to us, Christ revives our love and enables us to break our disordered attachments to creatures and root ourselves in him. And 1395, by the same charity that it enkindles in us, the Eucharist preserves us from future mortal sins. So not only does the Eucharist wipe away venial sins in the Roman Catholic view, but it also preserves one from future mortal sins. The more we share the life of Christ and progress in his friendship, the more difficult it is to break away from him by mortal sin. The Eucharist is not ordered to the forgiveness of mortal sins. That is proper to the sacrament of reconciliation. The Eucharist is properly the sacrament of those who are in full communion with the church. So, Eucharist can take away venial sins, it can prevent future mortal sins, and it can make it more difficult to break away from Christ in the Roman Catholic system. But only through the sacrament of reconciliation and penance can a person who has committed a mortal sin be restored. That gets into the sacrament of forgiveness. 1446, Christ instituted the sacrament of penance for all sinful members of his church, above all for those who, since baptism, have fallen into grave sin, and have thus lost their baptismal grace and wounded ecclesial communion. It is to them that the sacrament of penance offers a new possibility to convert and to recover the grace of justification. The fathers of the church present this sacrament as the second plank of salvation after the shipwreck, which is the loss of grace. So again, very clearly there, the Roman Catholic Catechism walks you through the sacrament of penance, that those since their baptism have fallen into mortal, or here called grave sin, whereby a person can be restored. 1447 gives a little bit more detail. Over the centuries, the concrete form in which the church has exercised this power received from the Lord has varied considerably. During the first centuries, the reconciliation of Christians who had committed particularly grave sins after their baptism, for example, idolatry, murder, or adultery, was tied to a very rigorous discipline, according to which penitents had to do public penance for their sins, often for years before receiving reconciliation. To this order of penitence, which concerned only certain grave sins, one was only rarely admitted, and in certain regions only once in a lifetime. During the 7th century, Irish missionaries, inspired by the Eastern monastic tradition, took to continental Europe the private practice of penance, which does not require public and prolonged completion of penitential works before reconciliation with the church. From that time on, the sacrament has been performed in secret between penitent and priest. This new practice envisioned the possibility of repetition, and so opened the way to a regular frequenting of this sacrament. It allowed the forgiveness of grave sins and venial sins to be integrated into one sacramental celebration. In its main lines, this is the form of penance that the church has practiced down to our day. So again, you can see how this doctrine has developed over time, according to the Roman Catholic Catechism here, that after baptism for grave sins, there is a private sacrament of reconciliation that occurs between the penitent and the priest that takes away that mortal sin and restores someone to a state of grace. We're getting somewhere with this because I do want to cover original sin and the fall in the Roman Catholic view and how this relates to concupiscence. So far we've seen that mortal sin has to have full consent, complete consent and full knowledge. And we've now seen how people are restored through the sacrament of penance or the Eucharist for at least venial sins. And now let's look at the consequences of Adam's sin for humanity. Original sin is directly bearing upon concupiscence and the desire of evil things. So let's look at this. 402 in the Roman Catholic Catechism, all men are implicated in Adam's sin. As St. Paul affirms, by one man's disobedience, many, that is all men, were made sinners. Sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all men sinned. The apostle contrasts the universality of sin and death with the universality of salvation in Christ. Then as one man's trespass led to condemnation for all men, so one man's act of righteousness leads to acquittal and life for all men. 403, following St. Paul, the Church has always taught that the overwhelming misery which oppresses men and their inclination towards evil, that's key, and death cannot be understood apart from their connection with Adam's sin and the fact that he has transmitted to us a sin with which we are all born afflicted, a sin which is the death of the soul. Because of this certainty of faith, the Church baptizes for the remission of sins even tiny infants who have not committed personal sin. So there it is in picture form there, very explicit words. I want you to see that in your mind, that in the Roman Catholic view, the original sin is that inclination towards evil that we all inherit in connection with Adam's sin and the fact that he's transmitted to us a sin with which we are all afflicted. And because of that, the Roman Catholic Church, the rationale for baptizing is the remission of sins of those infants and to wash away that original sin. And that takes away the consequences of original sin, at least for the guilt aspect of it. We'll see a little bit later some more of the distinctions that the Roman Catholic Church makes regarding this doctrine. 404, how did the sin of Adam become the sin of all his descendants? The whole human race is in Adam as one body of one man. By this unity of the human race, all men are implicated in Adam's sin, as all are implicated in Christ's justice. Still, the transmission of original sin is a mystery that we cannot fully understand. But we do know by revelation that Adam had received original holiness and justice, not for himself alone, but for all human nature. By yielding to the tempter, Adam and Eve committed a personal sin, but this sin affected the human nature that they would then transmit in a fallen state. It is a sin which will be transmitted by propagation to all mankind, that is, by the transmission of a human nature deprived of original holiness and justice. And that is why original sin is called sin only in an analogical sense. It is a sin contracted and not committed, a state and not an act. So Roman Catholic Catechism here very clearly talks about original sin being inherited from Adam as a state and not an act. It is a state of being deprived in nature of original holiness and justice, and therefore having that inclination towards sin, etc. Let's read about that. 405. Although it is proper to each individual, original sin does not have the character of a personal fault in any of Adam's descendants. It is a deprivation of original holiness and justice, but human nature has not been totally corrupted. It is wounded in the natural powers proper to it, subject to ignorance, suffering, and the dominion of death, and inclined to sin. And that's key to our discussion here. Because of original sin and the loss of that original holiness and justice, now we are in this state of original sin. Man's nature is wounded in its powers and therefore inclined to sin. An inclination to evil that is called concupiscence. And there's the term, and this is why I'm going through this. And immediately Rome is going to come and discuss baptism in discussion with this. an incline to sin, and inclination to evil that is called concupiscence. Baptism, by imparting the life of Christ's grace, erases original sin and turns a man back towards God, but the consequences for nature, weakened and inclined to evil, persist in man and summon him to spiritual battle. So 405 is so key to understanding the Roman Catholic view of concupiscence. Because that original sin, that loss of original holiness and justice in man leads to man being inclined to sin. So what do? We baptize, imparting the life of Christ's grace to erase that original sin and make man be inclined back towards God. However, I want you to see here also that the Roman Catholic Church is going to say that the consequences for nature, though, are still that nature is weakened and inclined to evil. Those persist in man and summon him to spiritual battle. But it will not be considered sin. We'll see that in a little bit. That original sin doesn't carry with it guilt after baptism. Baptism imparts the life of Christ's grace, erases original sin, turns a man back towards God. But the consequences for nature are that it's weakened and inclined to evil. So in other words, you will have concupiscence in the Roman Catholic view in the sense that you will have these evil desires, but they are not sin because you have the opportunity to fight against them, and unless you consent and have full knowledge of what you're doing, you haven't really committed a sin. It just summons you to spiritual battle. 406. The Church's teaching on the transmission of original sin was articulated more precisely in the 5th century, especially under the impulse of St. Augustine's reflections against Pelagianism, and in the 16th century in opposition to the what? The Protestant Reformation. And so we have to discuss this because Rome, specifically in their Catechism statement, states that, hey, we look back to Augustine against the Pelagians in the 5th century to fully articulate this issue on the transmission of original sin, but we also look back to the Protestant Reformation. So we have to discuss this because the Roman Catholic Church specifically mentions that they are in opposition to the Protestant, those who were Reformed, on this issue. And they go on to explain Pelagius held that man could, by the natural power of free will and without the necessary help of God's grace, lead a morally good life. He thus reduced the influence of Adam's fault to a bad example. I think that's a fair assessment of Pelagius. And then they go on to say that the first Protestant reformers, on the contrary, taught that original sin has radically perverted man and destroyed his freedom. They identified the sin inherited by each man with the tendency to evil, concupiscentia, which would be insurmountable. And we'll discuss that. We will look at what the Protestant reformers, what the Reformed Orthodox in their mature statements have said about this issue. Is it true that the first Protestant reformers taught that original sin has radically perverted man and destroyed his freedom? We'll look at that. They identified the sin inherited by each man with the tendency to evil, concupiscentia, which would be insurmountable. And if you know anything about Reformed theology, you know about total depravity, that man is corrupted in every aspect of his nature, including his will, and that no man seeks after God, and it requires God's regenerating grace to draw a man unto Christ, and God imparts the gift of faith. We're not going to get into all that. We're just, in this specific video, we just want to see what the Roman Catholic Church has to say about this issue of concupiscence, and then in a future video, we'll come back and we'll talk about the Reformed view and some of the contrast here. Picking back up in 406 in the Roman Catholic Catechism, the Church pronounced on the meaning of the data of revelation on original sin, especially at the Second Council of Orange in 529 and at the Council of Trent in 1546. In 978, in the Catechism of the Roman Catholic Church, it then goes on to discuss a little bit about baptism again. When we made our first profession of faith while receiving the holy baptism that cleansed us, the forgiveness we received then was so full and complete that there remained in us absolutely nothing left to efface, neither original sin nor offenses committed by our own will, nor was there left any penalty to suffer in order to expiate them. Yet the grace of baptism delivers no one from all the weakness of nature. On the contrary, we must still combat the movements of concupiscence that never cease leading us into evil. So you see it again here. In the Roman Catholic view, baptism is effective completely to remove sin, to forgive. Forgiveness is so full and so complete, there's absolutely nothing left to efface, neither original sin nor offenses committed by your own will. There's no penalty left. The grace of baptism, however, does not deliver one from the weakness of nature. So what Roman Catholics do is concupiscence is not a sin. It is part of the weakness of nature. Concupiscence is the result of original sin. However, that original sin is not a penalty, I guess, once you're baptized. It's not something that you are guilty for. You don't bear a guilt in Adam once you are baptized in the Roman Catholic Church. What you do bear is the weakness of nature. So they would say that baptism delivers no one from the weakness of nature. On the contrary, we must still combat the movements of concupiscence that never cease leading us into evil. So for the Roman Catholics, concupiscence remains as a weakness of nature. 979, in this battle against our inclination towards evil, what is that? Concupiscence. Who could be brave and watchful enough to escape every wound of sin? If the church has the power to forgive sins, then baptism cannot be her only means of using the keys of the kingdom of heaven received from Jesus Christ. The church must be able to forgive all penitents their offenses, even if they should sin, until the last moment of their lives. End quote there. So again, having this idea that the church is able to help those who have fallen towards the inclinations towards evil and to forgive their sins, baptism being one of the means of the keys of the kingdom of heaven. 980 says it is through the sacrament of penance. Again, we're elaborating. Penance, they very closely connect with baptism. It is through the sacrament of penance that the baptized can be reconciled with God and with the church. Penance has rightly been called by the Holy Fathers a laborious kind of baptism. This sacrament of penance is necessary for salvation for those who have fallen after baptism, just as baptism is necessary for salvation for those who have not yet been reborn. So again, the Roman Catholic Church very much connects baptism with the forgiveness of sins, in that when you are baptized, original sin is erased, and then all other sins are erased as well. And if there's a fallenness after that person has been baptized, then you go through the sacrament of penance. And so this is a laborious kind of baptism. This is all very important to know when we talk about what concupiscence is, because for them, concupiscence is just a weakness of nature. So let's keep going here. Just two more points from the Roman Catholic Catechism. 1263, by baptism all sins are forgiven, original sin and all personal sins. So note that in the Roman Catholic view, original sin is something that has to be forgiven, and two, something that has punishment due for it, but baptism still erases it. So 1263, by baptism all sins are forgiven, original sin and all personal sins, as well as all punishment for sin. So baptism forgives all sins, original and personal, and the punishment, therefore, due to that sin. So when a person's baptized, they're no longer guilty of original sin. Original sin still leaves them with the weakness of nature and concupiscence, but they can battle against that through the grace of baptism and the other sacraments. In those who have been reborn, nothing remains that would impede their entry into the kingdom of God. Neither Adam's sin, nor personal sin, nor the consequences of sin, the gravest of which is separation from God. 1264, yet certain temporal consequences of sin remain in the baptized. And you can imagine what would be one of those temporal consequences of sin that remains in the baptized. It would be the weakness of nature, primarily concupiscence. Certain temporal consequences of sin remain in the baptized, such as suffering, illness, death, and such frailties inherent in life as weakness of character, or weaknesses of character, and so on, as well as an inclination to sin that capital T tradition calls concupiscence, or metaphorically, the tinder for sin. Since concupiscence is left for us to wrestle with, it cannot harm those who do not consent, but manfully resist it by the grace of Jesus Christ. Indeed, an athlete is not crowned unless he competes according to the rules. So in the Roman Catholic system, concupiscence is a weakness of character. It's the result of a weakness of nature. It is a temporal consequence of sin that remains in the baptized and goes along with other things like suffering, illness, death, and other types of frailties. That essentially concupiscence is, for the Roman Catholic view, a frailty, a consequence of sin, but not a sin that is guilty of punishment itself in the baptized. So to review the Roman Catholic view, sin is divided into venial and mortal sins. Mortal sin requires full knowledge and deliberate consent. Therefore, concupiscence cannot be a mortal sin. It has to be something that would be acted upon. So could concupiscence be a venial sin? Well, there's an affirmation of original sin. Original sin includes an inclination to evil. Original sin is erased in baptism. Nevertheless, those baptized must combat the movements of concupiscence that never cease leading us into evil, because this is connected to a weakness of nature. This should not be viewed as a sin that has punishment due to it, but rather a temporal consequence of sin, i.e., concupiscence, having that evil desire and having to fight against those desires, is not sinful because all sin is forgiven at baptism. So concupiscence for the Roman Catholic is thus a temporal consequence of sin that reflects the weakness of nature and should not be viewed as a sin in those who are baptized. The baptized must wrestle with this weakness of character. Concupiscence, though, cannot harm those who do not consent. And as you can see, the second level of this, that is, the second level beyond the discussion of original sin and baptism, for the Roman Catholic, it has to do with the idea of volition. Rome is clear that mortal sins require full knowledge and complete consent. Concupiscence does not become a sin for Rome unless it is consented to. In fact, there's a deeper level of distinction here. And this time it's not a twofold distinction between venial and mortal, but a threefold one that is developed in scholasticism between the primo primi, the secundo primi, and the plane deliberati. And that is, as I'll look to Herman Bavinck here, as he puts it, the thoughts and desires that arise in us spontaneously before any consent of the will, that's one. Thoughts and desires that arise in us spontaneously before the consent of the will can be there. These, they would say, Roman Catholics would say, are not sinful. Two would be those against the will has offered resistance, but by which it was overpowered, and which are venial sins. Remember, in the Roman Catholic system, you have those less grave sins. These are just venial sins. They're, it was against the will, and the will offered resistance, but the will was overpowered. And so therefore, because the will is overpowered, it is a venial sin. And that can be forgiven in the Eucharist. And three, those to which the will has consciously and fully consented, and which are mortal sins. And again, remember, that is the definition of what a mortal sin is. It's grave. We'll go through a little bit more of that here in a second, but it has to be something that is submitted to consciously, full consent, full knowledge of it. So I want to come back to that. So that's the threefold distinction. Those thoughts and desires that arise spontaneously, that's not sinful at all, according to the Roman Catholic Church. Those against which the will offers resistance but is eventually overcome, it's a venial sin. Those which the will consciously and fully consents to, that's a mortal sin. Quoting again from the Roman Catholic Catechism, 1856 again, mortal sin, by attacking the vital principle within us, that is charity, necessitates a new initiative of God's mercy and a conversion of heart which is normally accomplished within the setting of the sacrament of reconciliation. I'll quote this part, which I did not quote before. When the will sets itself upon something that is of its nature incompatible with the charity that orients man toward his ultimate end, then the sin is mortal by its very object, whether it contradicts the love of God, such as blasphemy or perjury, or the love of neighbor, such as homicide or adultery. But when the sinner's will is set upon something that of its nature involves a disorder, but is not opposed to the love of God and neighbor, such as thoughtless chatter or immoderate laughter and the like, such sins are venial. You can see in this quote, very clear distinction between what is mortal and venial. Mortal sin strikes at the heart of charity and that which orients man towards its ultimate end. It contradicts the love of God and love of neighbor. 1856, for a sin to be mortal, three conditions must together be met. Mortal sin is a sin whose object is grave matter and which is also committed with full knowledge and deliberate consent. 1858, grave matter is specified by the Ten Commandments, corresponding to the answer of Jesus to the rich young man: do not kill, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false witness, do not defraud, honor your father and your mother. We will come back to that discussion when we discuss the Reformed Orthodox view of this, and the Roman Catholics in saying that grave matter is specified by the Ten Commandments. In other words, you break the Ten Commandments, you're committing a mortal sin. Do not kill, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false witness, do not defraud, honor your father and mother, etc. We'll discuss the Reformed view of the Ten Commandments and how that plays into this concept of concupiscence and evil desires. Do the Ten Commandments themselves include this concept of evil desires? A little bit of foreshadowing there. The gravity of sins is more or less great. Murder is graver than theft. One must also take into account who is wronged. Violence against parents is in itself graver than violence against a stranger. 1859. Mortal sin requires full knowledge and complete consent. It presupposes knowledge of the sinful character of the act, of its opposition to God's law. It also implies a consent sufficiently deliberate to be a personal choice. Remember, we talked about volition. Roman Catholics pull that in here, say that a mortal sin implies consent, sufficiently deliberate to be a personal choice. Feigned ignorance and hardness of heart do not diminish, but rather increase the voluntary character of a sin. So over against this view, what have the Reformed Orthodox proposed? Already you may know that there are vast areas of similarity and also of disagreement. Roman Catholics and Reformed Orthodox are discussing similar issues. Original sin. We discuss the same thing. What does baptism do, and to whom shall it be administered? What is sin? What is the nature of the human will, of desire and volition? What is sin? To look at these things will require another video. Stay tuned for part 2. We will discuss the Reformed Orthodox view of these same concepts. Thank you for watching.